Right now, sitting on the Bitcoin blockchain in plain sight, are coins worth well over $100 billion that a powerful enough computer could theoretically just walk in and steal. No hacking password required, no phishing email needed, just math. And in the last few months, the people who actually built Bitcoin security have quietly admitted this is no longer a distant science fiction worry. It is a live engineering problem with a deadline attached to it. If you own crypto, or you're thinking about buying some, what you're about to hear will change how you think about that seed phrase sitting in your drawer, and it might change how you think about every padlock icon you see in your browser too. Let's get straight into what actually happened, because this is not some vague warning from a random blog. In March of this year, Google's own quantum AI team published a detailed technical paper with a very specific and very alarming title, essentially outlining exactly how a quantum computer could break the elliptic curve. Cryptography that protects Bitcoin, Ethereum, and nearly every major cryptocurrency in existence. This is the same mathematical foundation called ECDSA and Schnorr signatures, built on something known as SECP-56K1 elliptic curve cryptography that has quietly protected trillions of dollars in digital assets for over a decade. Here is the part that should genuinely grab your attention. Google's paper did not just say this is theoretically possible someday. It gave real numbers. The researchers estimated that breaking this encryption would require roughly 1,200 logical qubits and fewer than 500,000 physical qubits running on a fast, superconducting quantum computer. Once a machine like that exists and is properly calibrated, deriving a single private key from a known public key could take as little as 9 minutes. 9 minutes. Not years. Not decades of brute force computation. 9 minutes per wallet, once the machine exists. And here is what makes this paper so much more unsettling than anything that came before it. It represented roughly a 20-fold reduction in the number of physical qubits researchers previously thought would be needed for this exact attack. In plain English, the wall separating today's crypto wallets from tomorrow's quantum computers just got dramatically thinner, almost overnight, based on new math rather than new hardware. Some of the paper's own co-authors have now assigned a genuine, non-negligible probability to a working attack machine existing by around the year 2032. That is not 100 years from now. That is potentially within the working lifetime of your current mortgage. And to be fair, this estimate still depends heavily on major future advances in error correction and qubit scaling that have not happened yet. So nobody serious is saying this is guaranteed or imminent. But the entire conversation around timing shifted dramatically the moment that paper came out, and it has not shifted back since. So let's talk about who is actually exposed right now, today, this very moment, because this is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. Not every Bitcoin wallet is equally vulnerable. The danger depends entirely on whether your wallet's public key has ever been exposed on the blockchain itself, which sounds technical. But the explanation is actually pretty simple once you break it down. When you receive Bitcoin, you're typically given an address, which is a scrambled, hashed version of your actual public key. As long as that public key stays hidden behind the hash and you never spend from that address, a quantum computer genuinely cannot do much with it, because reversing that hash is still considered mathematically impractical, even for quantum machines. But the moment you spend from an address, even just once, your full public key gets broadcast directly onto the blockchain for anyone or anything to see and store forever. That single detail changes everything. Once your public key is out there in plain view, permanently recorded on a public ledger that anyone can download and inspect, a sufficiently powerful quantum computer running an algorithm called Shor's algorithm could theoretically work backward from that exposed public key and derive your private key. Your private key is the one piece of information that controls your funds completely. And according to research published earlier this year, more than 34% of all Bitcoin currently in circulation sits in exactly this exposed category, because those coins live in older address types or addresses that have been reused for multiple transactions. 34%. That is not a rounding error. That is roughly 6.5 to 6.9 million Bitcoin, worth an almost unimaginable sum of money at current prices. And buried inside that exposed pile of coins is something even more strange and dramatic. An estimated 1.7 million Bitcoin sitting in ancient, untouched addresses widely. Believed to belong to Satoshi Nakamoto, the anonymous creator of Bitcoin itself, who has not moved a single coin in over a decade. If a quantum computer capable of this attack ever comes online, those dormant Satoshi coins become one of the single largest and most tempting targets in the entire history of finance. Now, before you go into full panic mode, let's be honest about where things actually stand today. No cryptographically relevant quantum currently exists anywhere on Earth. Not in a government lab, not at Google, not in China, nowhere. Current quantum hardware, even the most advanced systems from IBM and Google, is still far short of the scale, the error correction quality, and the stability needed to actually run this kind of attack against real-world cryptography. IBM's most powerful quantum processor today carries just over 1,100 qubits. And remember, the Google paper estimated you would need something closer to 500,000 physical qubits to pull this off reliably. That is a genuinely massive gap, and closing it is not simply a matter of throwing more money at the problem the way you might scale up a factory. It requires fundamental breakthroughs in quantum error correction that have not happened yet and might take years or even a decade or more to fully mature. Some researchers point out that error correction progress has actually been faster than expected in certain narrow benchmarks over just the past year, while other equally important engineering challenges, like maintaining stability across hundreds of thousands of linked qubits simultaneously, have proven far more stubborn than early optimistic projections suggested, which is exactly why credible timelines keep landing, somewhere in a wide range rather than a single confident date. Grayscale, one of the largest digital asset managers in the world, published its own outlook this year, calling quantum computing a red herring for crypto markets in the near term, specifically stating investors should not expect any meaningful impact on prices over the next 12 months, and projecting that a truly dangerous quantum computer is realistically at least 10 years away, likely not arriving until around 2030 at the earliest. So, which is it? Is this an urgent 5-alarm fire, or is it a red herring that will not matter for a decade? Honestly, the answer sitting underneath all the noise is both, depending entirely on your time horizon. And that nuance is exactly why the crypto industry has started acting now instead of waiting. Because here is the thing about cryptographic migrations at the scale of an entire global financial network. They're painfully slow. They require years of coordination across thousands of independent wallets, exchanges, and services. And if you wait until the threat is already knocking on the door, it is simply too late to respond in time. That exact realization is what pushed Bitcoin's own developers to finally act earlier this year. And what they proposed is honestly one of the more fascinating and controversial debates happening anywhere in the crypto world right now. In February, a group of Bitcoin developers published something called BIP 360, the network's very first quantum-resistant address format, introducing a new type of address called pay-to-Merkle root, specifically designed to keep your public key hidden even when you spend funds, closing off the exact exposure risk we just talked about. Then, 2 months later in April, things got a lot more intense. A follow-up proposal called BIP 361, formerly titled Post-Quantum Migration and Legacy Signature Sunset, was published by a group of developers including CASA's Chief Technology Officer, Jameson Lopp. This proposal did something genuinely unprecedented in Bitcoin's entire history. It suggested a 3-phase plan that would eventually make old quantum-vulnerable Bitcoin addresses completely unspendable, permanently frozen, if their owners fail to migrate their coins to the new quantum-safe format within a set window of time. Read that again, because it is a genuinely massive deal. Bitcoin has always operated on one sacred, unbreakable promise: your keys, your coins, forever, with no central authority, ever able to freeze or seize your funds. BIP 361 proposes putting an actual expiration date on that promise for a specific category of vulnerable coins. Under the current draft, roughly 3 years after a quantum-safe address format gets activated, wallets would be blocked from sending funds to the old legacy address types. About 2 years after that, in phase 2, all of those old legacy signatures would become invalid at the deepest level of the network itself, meaning the coins simply could not be moved anymore by anyone ever again using the old method. You can probably already guess how the Bitcoin community reacted to that idea. The backlash was immediate and, in many corners, absolutely furious. One user summed up the sentiment shared by a lot of longtime Bitcoin holders when they called the proposal highly authoritarian and confiscatory. Others pointed out the obvious irony that a network built explicitly to eliminate the need for trusted third parties was now proposing a mechanism that functions almost exactly like a trusted third party deciding which coins get to keep existing. Think about the philosophical knot this creates. The entire point of Bitcoin is that no government, company, or committee can ever freeze your money without your permission. Yet here are Bitcoin's own core developers proposing exactly that, freezing coins against the will of whoever holds them, specifically in order to protect the network from an even worse outcome: those same coins getting quietly drained by a quantum attacker instead. One of BIP 361's own co-authors, developer Ethan Heilman, has estimated that a full network-wide migration to quantum resilience would realistically take about 7 years, from the day the community even reaches consensus on doing it. 7 years is an eternity in the crypto world, and it tells you something important about just how seriously the people closest to this technology are actually taking the threat even while public market sentiment stays relatively calm on the surface. And then there is the Satoshi problem, which might be the single strangest wrinkle in this entire story. What do you do about a stash of roughly 1.7 million Bitcoin sitting untouched for over 15 years that legally and technically belongs to someone who may be dead, may have lost their keys, or may simply never intend to move those coins again? Freezing them under BIP 361 would strip Satoshi, or Satoshi's heirs, of the ability to ever prove ownership or move those funds using the original keys. In response, an entirely separate proposal emerged this year called PAX, short for Approval Address Control Timestamps, which would let holders of old vulnerable coins privately timestamp cryptographic proof that they currently control those funds without actually moving them, so that later on, if the network does eventually freeze legacy addresses, they could use futuristic quantum-resistant proofs, called Stark proofs, to unlock and reclaim their coins even after the freeze takes effect. It is a genuinely elegant technical solution to a genuinely bizarre problem, but it only works if whoever controls those old keys, including possibly Satoshi Nakamoto themselves, actually goes through the process of registering that proof before either a quantum attacker or the network's own freeze mechanism gets there first. If nobody ever comes forward to claim it, those coins simply stay in permanent limbo, frozen forever, an entire fortune locked away by the very defense mechanism built to protect it. Meanwhile, Bitcoin is not the only network racing against this clock. Ethereum, the second largest cryptocurrency network in the world, faces its own version of this exact same vulnerability. And honestly, in some ways, it is even more complicated over there. Ethereum's proof-of-stake system relies on something called BLS signatures to let validators confirm transactions and secure the network. Those signatures rely on very similar underlying elliptic curve math to what protects individual wallets, which means theoretically not just steal individual wallets, but actually impersonate validators directly, potentially subverting the entire consensus mechanism that keeps the Ethereum network honest. Think about how much more serious that is compared to a simple wallet theft. It is not just about someone's personal savings getting drained. It is about the actual integrity of the network's core security model being compromised at the validator level. Ethereum's own research and development teams have been actively exploring post-quantum cryptography solutions, but shifting an entire live financial network with hundreds of billions of dollars in value onto new validator-level cryptography is an extraordinarily delicate operation, nowhere near as simple as flipping a software update. Even smaller networks are jumping into this race to look prepared. Tron founder Justin Sun made headlines this year announcing that his network was launching a post-quantum upgrade initiative, publicly declaring an ambition to become the first major public blockchain to deploy fully NIST standardized post-quantum cryptographic signatures directly on its live mainnet. His public jab at Bitcoin's ongoing freeze debate was pointed and clearly designed to grab attention, essentially framing Tron as the network taking decisive action while Bitcoin argues internally about whether to freeze or lose coins to quantum theft. Other networks, including several newer proof-of-stake chains, built more. Recently, with cryptographic agility as an explicit design goal from day one, have quietly claimed they can swap in post-quantum signature schemes with far less community drama than Bitcoin currently faces, though those claims remain largely untested at real-world scale. That phrase, NIST standardized, is actually really important context worth pausing on for a moment. NIST, the United States National Institute of Standards and Technology, has spent years running a formal, rigorous global competition to identify and certify new cryptographic algorithms specifically designed to resist quantum attacks, an entire field now broadly known as post-quantum cryptography. These new standards are not crypto industry inventions. They are the same banks, militaries, and governments around their own long-term security planning, completely independent of the crypto world entirely. That broader context actually matters enormously here, because it tells you this is not just a Bitcoin problem or an Ethereum problem. It is a global cryptography problem that touches basically every secure system currently protecting sensitive information anywhere on the internet, from your online banking login to classified government communications. Crypto wallets simply happen to be one of the most visible, dollar-denominated, and immediately quantifiable targets, which is exactly why the warnings about them tend to generate the loudest headlines. So what does all of this actually mean if you personally own crypto right now, sitting somewhere between the panic and the reassurance? Security researchers and hardware wallet companies have started publishing a genuinely practical guidance on this exact question over the past several months, and the recommendations are honestly a lot more manageable than the scary headlines might suggest. The single most important practical step available to any crypto holder today is remarkably simple. avoid reusing Bitcoin addresses, and where possible, move funds out of any old address that has already broadcast its public key on-chain into a fresh address that has never been used to spend before. Remember what we talked about earlier. Your public key only becomes visible and vulnerable once you actually spend from an address. If you receive funds into a brand new address and never spend from it, your public key theoretically stays hidden behind the cryptographic hash, meaning there is currently no exposed target for a future quantum attacker to work backward from in the first place. This is not a permanent bulletproof solution because the underlying cryptographic algorithm itself would still eventually need to be upgraded to something quantum resistant, but it meaningfully reduces your personal exposure right now, today, using tools and habits that already exist inside every standard wallet. Hardware wallet companies have also been getting increasingly vocal about this over the past few months. Ledger, one of the largest hardware wallet makers in the world, published research this year specifically examining how quantum computing threatens blockchain security, and importantly, also started exploring a lesser discussed angle, whether post-quantum cryptographic algorithms themselves might introduce entirely new categories of side-channel attacks against the physical hardware wallets people already own. In other words, even the coming quantum-safe solutions are not automatically perfect. They come with their own new risks that engineers are only just beginning to fully understand and test. The broader message from nearly every serious voice in this space, whether that is Ledger, Bitcoin Core developers, or independent security researchers, tends to converge on the exact same theme. And it is worth repeating clearly because it cuts through a lot of the noise. This is not a today problem in the sense of your funds being at risk of theft this afternoon. But it is absolutely a today problem in the sense of preparation, because the migration required to fix it, decentralized financial system, realistically takes years, not weeks. And every year spent waiting and debating is a year not spent actually building and testing the solution. If you have made it this far into the video, you are clearly someone who wants the real technical picture instead of the panic-driven clickbait version of this story. And honestly, that is exactly the kind of audience this channel is built for. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button because we are going to keep tracking this quantum versus crypto story closely as it develops over the coming months. Let's also spend a moment on how this story connects to the broader, decade-spanning history of cryptography actually being broken in the real world, because it puts today's situation into useful perspective. Cryptographic systems that were once considered completely unbreakable have been broken before, more than once. And the pattern each time tends to follow a familiar shape. Experts warned for years that a given algorithm has a theoretical weakness. Most people ignore the warning because nothing bad has happened yet. And then eventually, either computing power catches up or a clever new mathematical technique emerges, and the previously unbreakable system becomes breakable almost overnight. The MD5 hashing algorithm, once considered perfectly secure and used everywhere across the early internet, was eventually broken through advances in computing power and cryptanalysis techniques, forcing a slow, painful, industry-wide migration away from it over the course of many years. The same basic story played out with an older encryption standard called DES, which took decades to fully retire from sensitive systems, even after its weaknesses were well understood by experts. Quantum computing represents a genuinely different category of threat, because unlike those earlier examples, the weakness here is not a flaw discovered through clever cryptanalysis of the existing algorithm. It is a fundamentally different kind of computer that breaks the underlying mathematical assumption the algorithm was built on in the first place. That distinction matters because it means there is no patch, no clever software fix, no minor adjustment that can shore up elliptic curve cryptography against a quantum attack, the way earlier vulnerabilities were sometimes patched over. The only real solution is a wholesale replacement with an entirely different mathematical foundation, which is exactly what post-quantum cryptography represents, and exactly why the migration conversation is so much more disruptive and contentious than previous cryptographic transitions the internet has quietly navigated before. There's one more historical parallel worth mentioning here too, because it offers a genuinely useful, more optimistic lens on all of this. The transition from unencrypted to encrypted web traffic, the shift that eventually put that little padlock icon in every browser address bar, took years of gradual, sometimes contentious industry-wide coordination before it became the reliable, invisible default that billions of people now depend on every single day without ever thinking about it. Nobody panicked their way through that transition successfully, and nobody solved it by ignoring it either. It took patient, deliberate, years-long coordination across an enormous number of independent companies, browser makers, and website operators, all moving roughly in the same direction over time. The quantum cryptography transition facing crypto wallets today looks set to follow a broadly similar shape, just compressed into a shorter, more urgent timeline and playing out under the added complication of Bitcoin's famously decentralized, leaderless governance model. Let's zoom out for a second and talk about why this whole situation feels so uniquely uncomfortable compared to other kinds of cybersecurity threats you have probably heard about before. With a normal hack, a company gets breached, passwords get stolen, and you change your password, update your security settings, and move on with your life relatively quickly. Quantum computing is fundamentally different. Mistaken how a specific company implemented their security. It attacks the actual underlying mathematics that essentially the entire modern financial internet is built on top of. Elliptic curve cryptography is not just protecting your Bitcoin wallet. It protects your bank's website when you log in. It protects the encrypted messages you send on your phone. It protects government communications, corporate networks, and our underlying mathematical assumptions. Crypto wallets simply happen to be one of the most extreme and visible test cases because, unlike a bank, there is frequently no customer service line to call, no fraud department to reverse a transaction, and no deposit insurance to make you whole again if something eventually goes wrong. If a quantum computer eventually drains an exposed wallet, in most cases, that money is almost certainly gone permanently, with no recourse whatsoever. That harsh reality is exactly why the crypto world has become something of an unlikely canary in the coal mine for the entire global cryptography transition that is quietly beginning to unfold across nearly every major industry right now. Because crypto asset ownership is so transparent, permanent, and immediately quantifiable in dollar terms, it has become one of the clearest, most public early test cases for a much larger and far more consequential problem that banks, governments, and corporations are all going to have to solve over the coming decade, whether the general public is paying close attention to it or not. It is also worth understanding just how genuinely difficult migrating an entire decentralized network actually is in practice, because this is not remotely comparable to a company simply pushing a routine software update to all of its users overnight. Bitcoin has no single central authority that can just flip a switch and force every single wallet, exchange, and service provider to instantly upgrade to new cryptography all at once. Every change has to go through a slow, deliberately conservative, and often deeply contentious community consensus process, exactly the kind of process we just watched play out in painstaking detail with the BIP 360 and BIP 361 debates earlier this year. Multiply that same challenge across every other major blockchain network currently in existence, each with its own separate governance structure, its own separate developer community, and its own separate set of technical constraints and competing priorities, and you start to understand why researchers keep hammering home the exact same urgent point again and again. The time to start this migration seriously is now, years, before the actual threat fully materializes, not after it does, because waiting until the last possible moment when a genuine cryptographically relevant quantum computer actually exists would almost certainly be far too late to protect the trillions of dollars currently sitting exposed across the entire crypto ecosystem. So where does this actually leave the average person holding crypto today, trying to make sense of headlines that swing wildly between full-blown panic and complete dismissal, depending entirely on which article you happen to click on first? The honest, balanced answer sits somewhere firmly in the middle. No, your Bitcoin is not about to get stolen by a quantum computer next week, or even necessarily within the next several years, because the hardware required simply does not exist yet anywhere on the planet, and building it requires scientific breakthroughs that have not happened. But yes, this is a real, serious, and rapidly accelerating engineering challenge that the smartest people working in cryptography and blockchain security take extremely seriously enough that Bitcoin's own core developers, an infamously slow-moving and deeply conservative community, have already started actively debating literally freezing coins to protect the network from a threat that technically does not exist yet in any working deployed form. That alone should tell you everything you need to know about how seriously the people who genuinely understand this technology at the deepest level are actually treating it behind the scenes, regardless of how calm the headline prices on any given day might currently look on your favorite exchange app. The practical takeaway is refreshingly simple, even if the underlying science absolutely is not. Avoid reusing old wallet addresses wherever you reasonably can. Pay attention to how major networks like Bitcoin and Ethereum handle their own quantum-safe migrations over the coming years, because those decisions will directly affect how your existing holdings eventually need to move and adapt. And resist the urge to either panic, sell everything today out of fear, or completely dismiss this topic entirely as pure science fiction hype. Because the truth, as usual with genuinely complicated technology stories like this one, sits firmly in the more nuanced, more interesting territory, in between those two extremes. Quantum computing has not broken crypto yet, and it very likely will not for a good number of years to come. But for the first time in Bitcoin's entire history, the people who built and maintain it are no longer treating that future as some distant, comfortable abstraction. They are actively redesigning the rules of the network itself, right now, in real time, to survive a threat that has not even fully arrived yet, and that alone should tell you this is a story worth paying very close attention to, whether you hold a fraction of a coin or you have never touched crypto in your life. Let's take a step back for a moment and actually walk through how a quantum attack like this would work in practice, because understanding the mechanics makes the whole threat feel a lot less abstract and a lot more concrete. Every Bitcoin transaction requires the sender to prove ownership of the funds using something called a digital signature, generated from a private key that only the owner should ever know. That private key mathematically corresponds to a public key, and the relationship between the two is designed so that deriving the private key from the public key using a normal computer would take longer than the age of the universe, even using every computer on Earth working together simultaneously. That one-way relationship is the entire foundation of modern digital security, not just for crypto, but for online banking, secure messaging, and nearly everything else that depends on encryption today. Quantum computers threaten to break that one-way relationship because of a mathematical breakthrough from the 1990s called Shor's algorithm, developed by mathematician Peter Shor. Shor's algorithm is specifically designed to solve exactly the kind of math problem that elliptic curve cryptography depends on, dramatically faster than any classical computer ever could, provided you have a quantum computer large enough and stable enough to actually run it. For decades, Shor's algorithm was considered a fascinating theoretical curiosity, because building a quantum computer powerful enough to actually run it against real-world cryptography seemed like something that might realistically be a century away if it happened at all. What changed this year is not that anyone built that machine. Nobody has. What changed is that Google's research dramatically lowered the estimated bar for how big that machine would actually need to be, which is exactly why the entire conversation shifted so quickly from comfortable theoretical distance to genuine near-term planning. There is also an important distinction worth understanding between two different kinds of quantum attacks that researchers talk about because they carry very different levels of urgency. The first is called an at-rest attack, where an attacker targets a public key that is already sitting exposed on the blockchain from an old or reused address and simply has as much time as they want to work on breaking it, since the target is not going anywhere. The second is called an on-spend attack. And this one is considerably scarier because it targets the brief window of time between when you broadcast a transaction, exposing your public key for the very first time, and when that transaction actually gets confirmed and locked into the blockchain permanently. That confirmation window can sometimes stretch to several minutes or even longer during periods of network congestion. And during that exact window, your public key is visible to the entire network before your transaction is finalized. In theory, a sufficiently fast quantum computer could potentially derive your private key during that brief exposure window and attempt to broadcast a competing transaction, redirecting your own funds to a different address before your original transaction even confirms. This is precisely the scenario Google's research paper flagged when it estimated an attack could potentially run in around 9 minutes for a primed machine, because many blockchain confirmation windows fall well within that exact time frame. If that sounds unsettling, that is because it genuinely is, and it is a big part of why researchers keep emphasizing that this problem needs solving well before a working machine exists, rather than after. Once a cryptographically relevant quantum computer is actually operational, even brand new, never before used addresses become vulnerable the moment you try to spend from them for the very first time, which means simply avoiding address reuse, while genuinely helpful today, would stop being a complete solution the instant such a machine actually comes online. There is an additional wrinkle worth understanding here, because BitMEX, one of the earliest and best-known cryptocurrency exchanges in the industry, actually proposed its own separate recovery framework earlier this year, well before the more famous BIP 360 and BIP 361 proposals gained mainstream attention. That plan outlined a two-step recovery process for standard wallets, involving something called hash commitments, followed by a private key revelation process, essentially giving users a structured way to prove ownership of their old, exposed coins ahead of time. The proposal also highlighted zero-knowledge proofs as a potentially more efficient alternative, a cryptographic technique that would let someone prove they control a set of coins without ever actually revealing their private key to anyone, even during the recovery process itself. It is a strong signal that this problem has multiple serious, competing solutions being explored simultaneously across different corners of the industry, rather than the community simply waiting around for one single official fix to eventually emerge from Bitcoin's core developers alone. It is worth pausing here to genuinely appreciate just how strange this entire situation actually is from a historical standpoint. Bitcoin was originally designed specifically to remove the need for trust in any central authority, precisely so that no bank, government, or company could ever unilaterally decide to freeze your funds. Now, less than 2 decades after its creation, the very community that built that system is seriously debating whether to build in exactly that kind of freezing mechanism, not because anyone wants centralized control, but because the alternative, doing nothing and leaving over a third of the entire supply permanently exposed to a future attacker, is arguably even more threatening to the network's long-term integrity and credibility. It is a genuinely fascinating case study in how even the most idealistic decentralization, obsessed technology in the world eventually runs into hard trade-offs that nobody fully anticipated at the very beginning. Let's talk a bit more about the hardware side of this story too, because the qubit race happening in labs around the world is directly connected to how seriously we should take this timeline. IBM currently operates quantum processors carrying more than 1,100 qubits, and the company has publicly stated ambitions to reach platforms carrying well over 4,000 qubits in the coming years through increasingly modular system designs. Google's Willow processor made headlines for a genuine breakthrough in quantum error correction, essentially proving that error rates can actually decrease as you add more qubits to a properly designed error-correcting cluster, which is the opposite of what happens with conventional computer chips, and represents one of the most important open problems in the entire field. Neutral atom quantum computing has also been advancing rapidly, with companies like Qira and Atom Computing demonstrating physical qubit arrays that are beginning to approach the raw scale researchers believe would eventually be needed for a serious cryptographic attack, even though raw physical qubit count alone is far from the only thing that matters here. Error rates, coherence times, and the ability to link qubits together into stable, reliable logical qubits capable of running long, complex calculations without falling apart are all equally critical pieces of the puzzle, and every one of those pieces still requires substantial breakthroughs before an actual working attack machine becomes a real-world possibility rather than a theoretical projection on a whiteboard. This is exactly why serious researchers tend to draw such a sharp distinction between physical qubits and logical qubits when they talk about this threat. A physical qubit is a single, raw quantum bit, inherently fragile and prone to errors from environmental noise, vibration, and temperature fluctuations. A logical qubit is a much more stable, reliable unit built by combining many physical qubits together using quantum error correction techniques, effectively using redundancy to cancel out the inevitable errors that any individual physical qubit will experience. Google's research paper specifically estimated the attack would require around 1,200 logical qubits, and building each single logical qubit today typically requires dozens, sometimes even hundreds, of physical qubits working together depending on the specific error correction scheme being used. Do the math on that, and you start to understand why estimates for when this threat actually becomes real vary so enormously depending on who you ask, ranging anywhere from the early 2030s on the more pessimistic end, all the way out to the 2040s, or even later on the more conservative end. Nobody actually knows the real answer yet, including the very researchers building these machines, because it depends entirely on breakthroughs in error correction technology that have not happened. And predicting the timing of scientific breakthroughs that have not happened yet is notoriously, famously unreliable, even for the world's top experts working directly in the field. Do the math on that, and you start to understand why estimates for when this threat actually becomes real vary so enormously depending on who you ask, ranging anywhere from the early 2030s on the more pessimistic end, all the way out to the 2040s or even later on the more conservative end. Nobody actually knows the real answer yet, including the very researchers building these machines, because it depends entirely on breakthroughs in error correction technology that have not happened, and predicting the timing of scientific breakthroughs that have not happened yet is notoriously, famously unreliable, even for the world's top experts working directly in the field. It is also worth mentioning that the semiconductor and quantum hardware industry itself has a genuinely mixed track record on timeline predictions, and that history should inform how much weight anyone puts on any single estimate, including the ones in this very video. Predictions about when quantum computers would achieve various milestones have shifted dramatically over just the past several years alone, sometimes accelerating faster than expected, and sometimes stalling out on unexpected engineering roadblocks that took much longer to solve than anyone originally anticipated. The honest, appropriately humble takeaway is that anyone offering you a single confident date for when quantum computers will break Bitcoin is almost certainly overstating their own certainty, because even the researchers actually building these machines describe their own timelines using ranges and probabilities rather than fixed dates. Now let's circle back to the practical side of this story, because understanding the threat is only half the picture. The other half is understanding what real, credible solutions actually look like. Post-quantum cryptography is not some vague, futuristic concept still stuck in a research paper somewhere. It already exists today, in working standardized form, thanks to years of rigorous competitive vetting led by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States. That process involved cryptographers from around the world submitting candidate algorithms, followed by years of intense adversarial testing designed specifically to find and break weaknesses before any algorithm ever got certified for real-world use. Several of these new algorithms have already been formally standardized and are beginning to see adoption across industries that have absolutely nothing to do with cryptocurrency, including banking infrastructure, government communications, and enterprise cybersecurity systems, precisely because the threat of quantum computing extends so far beyond crypto wallets specifically. The crypto industry is essentially trying to plug into the same broader, already validated body of cryptographic research, rather than inventing something completely new from scratch, which is honestly one of the more reassuring parts of this entire story once you actually understand how it works. The challenge, for blockchain networks specifically, is not really about whether quantum-resistant cryptography exists, because it clearly does. The challenge is entirely about migration, actually convincing, coordinating, and technically upgrading millions of individual wallets, thousands of independent exchanges, countless decentralized applications, and an entire sprawling, deeply decentralized ecosystem to actually adopt these new standards in a coordinated, timely way, without breaking compatibility, without introducing new bugs, and without triggering exactly the kind of community backlash we already saw play out with Bitcoin's BIP 361 proposal earlier this year. That migration challenge is arguably harder for crypto than for almost any other industry facing this exact same broader problem, and it is worth understanding why. A bank can push a cryptography upgrade to its own internal systems relatively quickly because it operates as a single centralized organization with direct control over its own infrastructure. A government agency can mandate new standards across its own departments through top-down policy, but Bitcoin has no CEO, no board of directors, and no central authority capable of simply issuing a mandate. Every single change has to earn broad, voluntary consensus across a famously stubborn, technically sophisticated, and deeply philosophically divided global community, many of whom, understandably, are deeply suspicious of any change that even slightly resembles centralized control over their money. This is precisely why the timing question matters so enormously here, arguably even more than it does for other industries facing the same underlying cryptographic transition. If Bitcoin's community had waited until a working quantum computer capable of this attack actually existed before even beginning this conversation, the 7-year migration timeline that developer Ethan Heilman estimated earlier this year would already be starting from a position of active, ongoing crisis, with billions of dollars potentially already being drained in real time, while the community argued about the technical details of a fix. Starting the conversation years in advance, uncomfortable and contentious as it clearly already is, gives the network at least a fighting chance of actually completing the transition before it becomes genuinely urgent. There's also a fascinating economic angle to all of this worth exploring, because the quantum threat does not affect all crypto holders equally. And understanding that asymmetry tells you a lot about who actually needs to pay close attention to this story right now, versus who can reasonably afford to wait and watch from a safe distance. If you hold your crypto on a modern hardware wallet using addresses you have never spent from, your practical exposure today is genuinely quite low, and you likely have plenty of time to migrate calmly once quantum safe standards become widely available and well tested across the ecosystem. But if you are someone holding coins in old, reused addresses, or if you are managing a business, an exchange, or a custody service, handling other people's funds at scale, this story deserves your genuine active attention right now, not years from now. Exchanges in particular sit in an especially exposed position because they typically manage enormous pools of customer funds across addresses that get reused constantly for operational efficiency, exactly the pattern that creates maximum public key exposure across the entire system. Several major exchanges have already begun quietly exploring their own internal migration plans, even while public-facing announcements remain relatively rare, because nobody wants to be the company that triggers unnecessary panic among their own user base before a genuine solution is actually ready to deploy. It is also worth mentioning the insurance and institutional angle here, because this story is not just playing out among individual retail crypto holders scrolling through their phones. Major financial institutions considering deeper cryptocurrency exposure, whether through direct holdings, exchange-traded funds, or custody services, are increasingly factoring quantum risk into their own long-term risk assessments. This creates a genuinely dynamic where institutional adoption of crypto, something the industry has spent years actively courting, now runs directly into a brand new category of long-term technological risk that simply did not exist as a serious mainstream consideration even just a couple of years ago. Some of the more sophisticated institutional players have started asking pointed questions that individual retail investors rarely think to ask, like whether a given custody provider has a concrete, tested quantum migration plan in place, whether that plan has actually been rehearsed under realistic conditions rather than just written down on paper, or whether a particular blockchain network's governance structure is actually capable of executing a coordinated cryptographic upgrade within a reasonable time frame before a real threat materializes. Those questions are becoming an increasingly normal part of institutional due diligence processes around digital assets, even while the general public conversation remains largely stuck bouncing between panic and dismissal, rarely landing anywhere near the more nuanced middle ground where the real, honest answer actually lives. Regulators have started circling this topic too. Even if formal rules remain years behind the actual technology, financial oversight bodies in several major jurisdictions have begun, quietly asking custodians and exchanges about their long-term cryptographic resilience plans, treating quantum preparedness as an emerging component of standard operational risk assessment, rather than a purely theoretical academic concern. That kind of regulatory attention tends to move slowly, often trailing years behind where the technical community already stands, but its mere presence signals that this conversation has genuinely graduated from a niche cryptography forum topic into something mainstream financial infrastructure now has to seriously account for. Let's also talk briefly about why this entire story genuinely matters, even if you personally have zero interest in owning cryptocurrency at all, because the implications here stretch far beyond just Bitcoin and Ethereum specifically. The exact same underlying elliptic curve cryptography currently protecting crypto wallets also protects an enormous portion of the encrypted internet traffic flowing around the entire planet every single second, including the padlock icon you see in your browser when you check your email, log into your bank account, or shop online. Governments and major technology companies around the world have been quietly racing to upgrade their own systems to post quantum standards for exactly the same underlying reasons, just with far less public drama and far fewer viral headlines than crypto's more visible, more transparent, more dollar-denominated version of this exact same story. In many ways, crypto's transparent, immutable, publicly auditable nature has actually made it one of the clearest and most useful real-world test cases for how this much larger global cryptographic transition is likely to unfold across other industries over the coming decade. Because every Bitcoin transaction is permanently recorded on a public ledger that anyone can inspect, researchers can measure exactly how much value sits exposed at any given moment, something that is genuinely difficult, sometimes even impossible to measure with comparable precision inside a traditional bank's private, closed internal systems. That transparency is uncomfortable in the short term because it makes the scale of the exposure so visible and so quantifiable in real dollar terms, but it is also exactly what has forced this conversation to happen years earlier and with far more urgency than it likely would have inside a more opaque traditional financial system. It is also worth mentioning the insurance and institutional angle here, because this story is not just playing out among individual retail crypto holders scrolling through their phones. Major financial institutions considering deeper cryptocurrency exposure, whether through direct holdings, exchange-traded funds, or custody services, are increasingly factoring quantum risk into their own long-term risk assessments. This creates a genuinely interesting dynamic where institutional adoption of crypto, something the industry has spent years actively courting, now runs directly into a brand new category of long-term technological risk that simply did not exist as a serious mainstream consideration even just a couple of years ago. Some of the more sophisticated institutional players have started asking pointed questions that individual retail investors rarely think to ask, like whether a given custody provider has a concrete, tested quantum migration plan in place, whether that plan has actually been rehearsed under realistic conditions rather than just written down on paper, or whether a particular blockchain network's governance structure is actually capable of executing a coordinated cryptographic upgrade within a reasonable time frame before a real threat materializes. Those questions are becoming an increasingly normal part of institutional due diligence processes around digital assets, even while the general public conversation remains largely stuck bouncing between panic and dismissal, rarely landing anywhere near the more nuanced middle ground where the real, honest answer actually lives. Regulators have started circling this topic too, even if formal rules remain years behind the actual technology. Financial oversight bodies in several major jurisdictions have begun, quietly asking custodians and exchanges about their long-term cryptographic resilience plans, treating quantum preparedness as an emerging component of standard operational risk assessment, rather than a purely theoretical academic concern. That kind of regulatory attention tends to move slowly, often trailing years behind where the technical community already stands, but its mere presence signals that this conversation has genuinely graduated from a niche cryptography forum topic into something mainstream financial infrastructure now has to seriously account for. Let's also talk briefly about why this entire story genuinely matters, even if you personally have zero interest in owning cryptocurrency at all, because the implications here stretch far beyond just Bitcoin and Ethereum specifically. The exact same underlying elliptic curve cryptography currently protecting crypto wallets also protects an enormous portion of the encrypted internet traffic flowing around the entire planet every single second, including the padlock icon you see in your browser when you check your email, log into your bank account, or shop online. Governments and major technology companies around the world have been quietly racing to upgrade their own systems to post quantum standards for exactly the same underlying reasons, just with far less public drama and far fewer viral headlines than crypto's more visible, more transparent, more dollar-denominated version of this exact same story. In many ways, crypto's transparent, immutable, publicly auditable nature has actually made it one of the clearest and most useful real-world test cases for how this much larger global cryptographic transition is likely to unfold across other industries over the coming decade. Because every Bitcoin transaction is permanently recorded on a public ledger that anyone can inspect, researchers can measure exactly how much value sits exposed at any given moment, something that is genuinely difficult, sometimes even impossible, to measure with comparable precision inside a traditional bank's private, closed internal systems. That transparency is uncomfortable in the short term because it makes the scale of the exposure so visible and so quantifiable in real dollar terms, but it is also exactly what has forced this conversation to happen years earlier and with far more urgency than it likely would have inside a more opaque traditional financial system.